You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 27th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
What is happening now in Belarus is a farce. This is not an election, but a special electoral operation to keep Lukashenko in power.
We'll bring you the results of Europe's most predictable election as Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko wins a seventh term in office. Also coming up...
Playback number one!
Another successful handover of hostages and prisoners between Israel and Hamas, but not without each side accusing the other of breaching the terms of the ceasefire deal. We'll have the latest. We'll also hear the latest climate news, look at Monday's papers and explore why, thanks to the French government, we can forevermore. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. Ceremonies will be held to mark the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi death camp Auschwitz-Birkenau, where 1.1 million people were murdered during the Second World War. Palestinian and Arab officials have condemned Donald Trump's suggestion that Gazans be moved to neighbouring countries, clearing the way for reconstruction. And bird's DNA has been found in both engines of the Jeju Air aircraft that crashed last month in South Korea, killing 179 people. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the result of yesterday's elections in Belarus was known long before a single vote was cast. After 3 decades in power, President Alexander Lukashenko shows no sign of wanting to move on, and a 7th term in office was a certainty. Well, yesterday, immediately after casting his ballot, he embarked upon a press conference lasting a good 4 hours. So to tell us what's happened over this weekend and what this means for the country, I'm joined now by Hanna Liubakova, who's a Belarusian journalist and non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. A very good morning to you, Hanna.
Hello.
So, without any great surprise, he won with 87% of the votes. Is that correct?
Well, these were the results of the exit polls yesterday. Today, actually at night, the Central Election Commission, as we call it, published the preliminary result. So he's winning apparently with 86.82%. So it's slightly less than Putin last year.
Right. OK. Nonetheless, it is a significantly large margin for an election that many people, in fact, I don't think anybody was any doubt about who the winner was going to be.
Yeah, that's correct. And obviously for many reasons. So first of all, there were only 4 candidates, but there were spoilers. These were the candidates that were pre-approved by the regime, by the system itself. And all of them were basically saying that we are running not against Lukashenko, but with Lukashenko. Some of them were openly praising Alexander Lukashenko, and the 4 of them combined, according to the Election Commission, have now not more than 9%. So you see the difference. And of course, when it comes to the entire situation, the repression escalated. They never stopped after 2020, after the mass protests. But leading up to the elections, they became even worse. There is not possible for media to operate. There were no independent observers in the country. So basically, as you imagine, the atmosphere of fear and state terror exists in Belarus. And indeed, as you said, it felt like a special sort of military electoral campaign and not the democratic process.
The astonishing press conference that Lukashenko held yesterday, immediately after casting his vote, before the ballot had even closed, in the the words that were coming out of his mouth were quite remarkable. He said, I couldn't care less whether you recognise our election or whether you don't. He was saying that to the international community. But he was also talking about his opponents and saying everyone has the right to choose. That is democracy. Some choose prison, others choose exile. We never forced anyone out of the country. And this is very much an incredibly real description of what's happening in Belarus, isn't it? But to have Lukashenko say that people choose to go to prison or exile is extraordinary.
How cynical, right? And that also became possible because there were several foreign journalists in the country who were reporting on the elections, which was brave. And I think this is the example of great journalism. So that was Steve Rosenberg from the BBC who asked this question. And as you see, when Lukashenko is faced with the sort of more critical questions, he is going off rail. And he allows himself to say such, cynical things because otherwise it's all very much scripted, and he doesn't really expect any critical questions from journalists. So there was another question regarding the protests in 2020, and he said that there were only not many people, like several thousand people. As we know, there were hundreds of thousands for months protesting, and the French journalist actually told him so, and he denied it. So you see, there was when he's faced with some sort of not scripted questions, he's very much lost, and he talks about this. And of course, when it comes to repression, the number of political prisoners, only the names that human rights defenders know, is more than 1,200 people. And since 2020, there have been tens of thousands of people who went through prison. I'm also in exile, and I cannot go back to Belarus, and that's definitely not the choice that I made myself. I would love to go back to my country, but I cannot. Last year, I was sentenced to 10 years in absentia by a court in Minsk, and I'm also labeled a terrorist in the country. So that's far away from being my own choice, and far away, of course, from being any democracy or any democratic process in the country.
How much trace or how strong a voice does remain in Belarus, given the fact that we talked about the last elections in August 2020, when we saw these widespread anti-government protests, some of the biggest in Belarusian history, and Lukashenko launches a brutal crackdown on it. So what voices do remain?
Well, it's been 5 years, almost 5 years of this state terror, of the really unprecedented repression, even for Europe in the past decades. And it's really impossible to do any sort of political activity inside the country at this point. Independent media had to flee, civil society organizations have been dissolved, have been liquidated, and also forced to flee. And again, many people also had to relocate in fear of persecution. So inside the country, there is visible silence. But of course, having seen these hundreds of thousands of people on the streets, these massive demonstrations, and seeing what's happening now, it's really hard to believe that people agreed, that people have given up, right? They remain silent because that's the way for them to survive. I know that what people do right now, they are focusing more on cultural initiatives. They rediscover their national identity. They learn the Belarusian language. As you might know, we have 2 official languages, Russian included. So most people speak Russian. So for people, learning Belarusian is also the way of sort of showing their dissent. And knowing from the history of the Soviet Union that might seem that not much, but actually such things also strengthen national identity, which is really crucial for Belarusians right now.
What about the international community? I mean, we've mentioned already the fact that you are in exile, and you are one of, 500,000 Belarusians who had to flee after 2020. Many of those who have fled are in the likes of Lithuania and in Poland, which creates actually a problem for Lithuania and Poland, doesn't it? Not in terms of politics, but in terms of logistics. I mean, what is life like outside Belarus, clearly without telling us where you are?
Well, of course, those countries, both Poland and Lithuania and other countries and in the EU and even, around the world, basically, where Belarusians are right now. These large diasporas still, also in Georgia, some are in Germany, in the US, and in the Czech Republic. So there are certain I think what changes that have been introduced since 2020, and these countries are clearly helping, knowing what the situation is. Of course, more can be done. There is always more that can be done. But I think many of us are really grateful to these countries for giving us, this opportunity to live in a safe place. When it comes to legalization, like residence permits, when it comes to the registration of our media outlets, of our organizations in this country, again, many civil society organizations had to flee. So there is a lot of conversations, of course, because in Lithuania, there are less than 70,000 Belarusians here, and it feels for people like there are way too many. In Poland, there are hundreds of thousands of Belarusians at least. So for many countries, of course, it's becoming like an issue because they have to think about the migration, about the level of migration. But when it comes to support for dissident, for the opposition, for people who had to leave, to flee, I think these countries are really on board.
And in terms of the way that the rest of the European or indeed the international community treats Belarus, many seeing it as almost an extension of Moscow, given the closeness of the relationship with between Alexander Lukashenko and Vladimir Putin in Moscow, Belarus being a sort of a launch pad for so many aspects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Last night we saw the Belarusian opposition leader in exile, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. She was due to meet the EU's 27 foreign ministers last night. Is there a sense that anything can be done by the outside world, or does it just have to be a waiting game for the demise of Lukashenko?
Well, there are many things that can be done and are being done, of course. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and the democratic forces of Belarus in exile are lobbying for, advocating for increased pressure on the regime, for human rights violations, and also for the participation, co-aggression in the invasion against Ukraine. So that's one of the main topics, of course, support and assistance for civil society and independent media. We, independent media, are reaching people inside the country. These are millions of people that we are reaching monthly. So that's one of the most effective ways how to stay connected with the population inside Belarus. And such things would be the subject of discussions today. And by the way, Hungary was one of the countries, the country that actually blocked the joint statement of 27 EU members. So that's regarding the sham elections in Belarus. So that's also something that the EU has to deal with such countries inside the bloc. So these are some of the, I think, issues that will be discussed. Of course, the unity of the bloc, but also the strategy and tactical steps regarding Belarus and Belarus involvement in the invasion, and of course, human rights violation.
Hanna Liubakova, thank you so much for joining us on the line. You're listening to The Globalist. 9:13 a.m. in Beirut, 7:13 here in London. Now, a second exchange of prisoners and hostages between Israel and Hamas was completed this weekend without any major incident. A week after a ceasefire came into effect, 4 Israeli female soldiers were freed in a ceremony tightly controlled by Hamas, with 200 Palestinian inmates released from Israeli jails in return. However, Israel had complained that a civilian Arbel Yehud should have been among those freed, and then accused Hamas of breaching the terms of the ceasefire deal. Hamas has responded by accusing Israel of blocking displaced Palestinians from returning home to northern Gaza. Well, to bring us up to date, I'm joined on the line from Brussels now by Yus Hilterman, who's Programme Director of the Middle East and North Africa International Crisis Group. Very good morning to you, Yus. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning to you. Thank you for having me.
We have this problem over the weekend that we have two parallel narratives, don't we? We have the successful release and the incredibly emotional pictures of 4 young female soldiers being reunited with their families, having been released by Hamas. But then we also have a second narrative now rumbling, don't we, where both sides are beginning to accuse each other of not abiding to the ceasefire agreement.
Well, that is what did happen, but I think it's been overcome now, fortunately. So we now have an agreement between Israel and Hamas, and I think internally between Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to release the Israeli hostage, the civilian, early, before the next scheduled exchange, which is next Saturday. So probably by Thursday, we'll see Arba being exchanged. And then along with actually two other Israeli hostages. So, and meanwhile, as I'm speaking, Palestinians are being led through the Netzarim crossing into northern Gaza, and so that problem has been resolved for the moment.
Which is incredibly positive news. What does it say, though, that within the instant, the minute that something doesn't seem to go entirely to the plan of one or the other side, that the accusations suddenly fly about breaking the ceasefire, that one would hope that cool heads would prevail here instead?
Well, I think it's inherent in fragile ceasefires that sides accuse each other of violations. You see it time and again in other situations as well. So I'm not really that surprised. And that is even assuming that both sides are fully committed to the ceasefire. And I'm not even convinced of that. I think they're committed to the first stage of this particular three-stage ceasefire. We'll have to see once that ends. The first stage is 42 days long, whether we move to a second stage. Those negotiations about the second stage are supposed to start in about a week or 10 days. And then we can see how committed really the parties are to the extension of the ceasefire. And keep in mind that this is a ceasefire that talks about an exchange of Israeli hostages held by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza in exchange for Palestinian prisoners in Israel. It doesn't talk about what will happen to Gaza after all of that. Who will govern Gaza? What will happen to this utterly destroyed enclave? And that is, of course, a question that is critical to Palestinians who live there, but also to the security of Israel.
And not helped, arguably, by the comments of the US President Donald Trump. Yesterday, I think it was Saturday, apologies, he said that large numbers of Palestinians should leave Gaza just to clean out the whole strip. After he ordered the US military to restart shipments of bombs to Israel. And the comments that were made to the Jordanian King Abdullah on Saturday have prompted a furious reaction from large swathes of the Arab world, and indeed from the human rights rapporteur, who've compared this with ethnic cleansing.
Yes, and in fact, it helps that Trump mentioned clean out, because that already evokes the notion of ethnic cleansing, which it would be. And so, it's going to inflame the Arab world to talk about the forced removal of Palestinians from their land, or from what remains of their land. But Donald Trump is a real estate businessman. I'm not sure he was successful in that, but at least he sees the world through that prism. And to him, the Gaza Strip is a piece of real estate. I don't think he has any political notion of the history, of the sentiments of the population, of what happened in 1948, in what happened in 1967, or ever in the last decade. And so it doesn't matter to him. He just thinks, well, these people wouldn't want to live there anyway, so why don't they go into neighboring Egypt and into Jordan? And of course, if you look at the situation in Jordan, which already has a very large proportion of people of Palestinian origin, which the kingdom sees as a potential threat to its own control and the control of the Transjordanian people there. All of that, it could really cause huge mayhem if a new wave of Palestinian refugees were to enter the country. And in Egypt, where would they go? Into the Sinai Desert. Of course, Egypt doesn't want this. Egypt cannot accommodate this, wouldn't want to accommodate it, because it is an issue that resonates so strongly throughout the Arab and Muslim worlds.
What does, however, the introduction of a character like Donald Trump do to the dynamic, given the fact that there has been uproar against his comments, but the likes of Israel may respond more favourably to them?
Well, there's certainly an echo in Israel among the far right, and maybe not even among the far right, but there are certainly voices that say, well, maybe this is the solution. We've heard from the beginning, after October 7th, 2023, when Hamas carried out this horrific attack, that maybe the Palestinians should go to Canada or to some other, into Egypt. So there are definitely supporters for this notion inside Israel. The question is, how do you do it? And under what circumstances would you want to do it, and at what cost? Because this would not be an easy undertaking.
Tell us finally about the another fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel's military have said that it will not complete its withdrawal from southern Lebanon by yesterday. That had been outlined in the truce agreement. Where does this leave the situation?
Well, there have been follow-on negotiations, and now we have an extension of the deadline for the Israeli troop withdrawal from Lebanon till about the middle of February 17th or 18th, I think, and so the sides have agreed to that. So that will keep things hopefully calm until then. But the ceasefire is still in place. The ceasefire didn't have a deadline, but of course, for the Lebanese, the ceasefire deadline is linked to the Israeli troop withdrawal, and so that has now been extended. But let's hope that things turn out the way they were designed.
Joost Hilterman, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Brussels. Still to come on today's programme.
And what is very striking in this speech is that President Zelensky talked about Europe. And it was one of the first times where he was very much centering his message as one of the European family.
And we hear later about Europe's plans to help rebuild a post-war Ukraine. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with a look at today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say joining me in the studio is Terry Stiesny, political journalist and author and regular voice around the microphones. Hello, Terry. How's life in the Stiesny world?
Yeah, good morning. Life is pretty good. Yeah, had a good Christmas, a lovely New Year, and everything's all sort of back to normal, back to school, back to university.
Seems like a long time ago, doesn't it?
It does already. Yes.
I know that Nick Moniz, our design editor, says that the year doesn't start until February. Give him that. Let's talk about a story starting off. I think when everybody sort of like wound down in the European side of things last night, there was the prospect of a big bust up between Colombia and the United States. And yet in the last few hours, that has all been smoothed over, and the papers is really quite struggling to keep up with what's going on. It feels like we're now in the sort of like at Trump speed.
Yes, I think definitely everybody was sort of prepared to announce a massive trade war kicking off between the United States and Colombia, which does seem to have been patched up for now. And so, The Guardian here, for instance, is reporting that Colombia has now lifted the ban on deportation flights. So the background to this story is that Colombia didn't want to accept military planes deporting Colombians, migrants from the United States. Donald Trump then threatened to introduce 50% tariffs on Colombian exports, things like coffee and cut flowers. Apparently this could have been a particularly big problem just ahead of Valentine's Day, apart from all the other sort of geopolitical conflicts. And the Colombian president said that he was going to retaliate and have tariffs on goods from the United States. Now, overnight, as you say, this seems to have been kind of patched up. Colombia has now said that it will accept the aircraft. And one of the things that Colombia was most upset about, really, was the way that deportees were being treated. They said that they weren't being treated in a humane manner. They wanted their citizens to be treated with dignity. And there seem to have been similar problems with Brazil to do with the conditions in which people were flown out of the United States. But I think what we can learn from this so far is I think this is going to be a pattern. There are going to be lots of incidents around the world where there are threats and there are counter threats. And it's going to be a question of, who blinks blinks first and who backs down.
Indeed. I mean, Donald Trump absolutely taking things to the brink here. What I find astonishing is the widespread coverage of this story. It is, I mean, if you just look, we're not one often to cover the Daily Mail here in Monocle Studios, but the top story on the Mail Online's website is Bogota backs down, Trump wins migrant deportation war with Colombia in hours. Washington slapped 25% tax on imports when Bogota refused to let military flights return illegals. Now humiliated President Petro sends his plane to collect them. Two things here. Firstly, the idea that Trump is now grabbing the headlines immediately. But secondly, if you are a right-wing publication or if you are a populist government, you're going to start to be energised by these kinds of stories, aren't you?
Yes, I think particularly the way that it is being spun out of the United States is to suggest that this has worked. I mean, the White House statement late last night was saying the government of Colombia has agreed to all of President Trump's terms. I mean, now, whether that's the case and whether that's what Colombia thinks they've done is another matter. But the fact that yes, you can make these threats and you can suddenly get the whole world interested in it and sort of worked up about it. I think, a lot of people might think, well, if this is how it goes now, this might work.
Let's move on to a story which will dominate the headlines for the next 24 hours, and rightly so. It is the 80th anniversary today of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Nazi death camp in which 1.1 million people were killed. We have lots of coverage happening today and lots of testament from the remaining survivors, many of whom now are in their 90s. I think about 50 of them are going to Auschwitz-Birkenau today for the ceremonies. The way that Germany has responded to this, Olaf Scholz has made quite a stark warning, hasn't he, about the fact that young people in Germany now don't know what the Holocaust was.
Yes, I mean, it's quite interesting. If you look at the German coverage, one of the things you notice is that sort of election campaigning has really paused. A lot of all the German party leaders are all going to Auschwitz to pay their respects there, along with other international leaders. And there was even some concern that putting them all on the same plane might be problematic, might be a risk, and then you couldn't have the whole German leadership all travelling together. That's the sort of the logistics of it is the least of it, really. But Olaf Scholz is saying he's really concerned how many young people in Germany don't know enough about the Holocaust, and that was echoed by Cem Özdemir, his education minister, and saying that really they're pointing to some surveys in Germany which suggest that more than 1 in 10 young German people between 18 and 29 hadn't even heard of the Holocaust, which I find really surprising, given that over generations how much young German people had been told and had been educated, in a very deliberate policy to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again. It's been really drummed into people. And this survey also suggesting that 40% of young Germans in that age group didn't know that 6 million Jews had been killed during the Holocaust. And of course, German government very much saying, we can never allow this to be forgotten, this crime, and, it's important for democracy that we continue to remember it.
And there is this acute problem that Germany now faces, that 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz, we are looking at the rise of a far-right party, which is attempting very strongly to try to normalise far-right positions with anti-Semitic rhetoric, with the use in certain areas of pro-Nazi slogans. And it's that really dangerous moment, isn't it, where if you don't know what this means, then you're not going to see the danger.
Yes, and particularly when you have got, the likes of Elon Musk weighing in, talking to the AfD and sort of making suggestions that Germany didn't have anything to feel guilty for, and sort of ignorant comments like that, really. And it is, very important, obviously, in all countries to continue to impress on people and to remember what happened, and particularly to listen to that testimony of the people who survived, who, fortunately some of them have now lived long lives, but for whom this might be the last, big anniversary that they are able to attend.
Finally, we must touch on something slightly lighter. Well, I don't know. Would you spend 24 hours watching Igor Levit play the same piece of music 840 times?
I'm not sure. So this is apparently going to happen in London at the South Bank Centre, and it's a piece by Eric Satie, which is called Vexations, and apparently it's quite a simple piece. It fits on a single sheet of music. The problem just is that you have to play it 840 times in a row. This has very rarely been done, and also it's part of a performance arts thing expected to last between 16 to 22 hours with Marina Abramovich involved in it. They're going to destroy the set as well. As this happens, it will be gradually dismantled, allowing listeners, it says here, to get in the Times, to get closer to the pianist as he tries to complete the feat without passing out and ideally staving off hallucinations along the way.
I'm not sure he'll be the only one having hallucinations. The great thing is that the way that the Times has covered this, it's not where's the creativity of this, the fact that you have Marina Abramovich and Igor Levit, two great show people, and great performance artists, and those who have daring and courage. The only question that the Times wants to know is how's he going to go to the loo?
Well, the answer to this question is that apparently discreet facilities will be provided on stage but out of sight, and he will be allowed to eat. But it's a great feat for the audience. But you can apparently say the audience can come in, drop in and out when you want. So, but I think the risk is it could take any time between 16 and 22 hours. So, what happens if you want to stay right till the end and then you pop out for a break or a snooze and it's all over?
That's a whole new article that the Times hasn't
Apparently
written.
One of the last times it was performed, they got to the end and somebody shouted encore.
Terry Stiesny, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. The time here in London is 7:30 a.m. You're at The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. Let's have a look at some of the other stories we're keeping an eye on today. Ceremonies will be held today to mark the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi death camp Auschwitz-Birkenau. Up to 50 survivors will return to the site where 1.1 million people were murdered during the Second World War. Palestinian and Arab officials have condemned Donald Trump's suggestion that Gazans will be moved to neighbouring countries, clearing the way for reconstruction. The UN Human Rights Rapporteur has likened such a move to ethnic cleansing. Bird DNA has been found in both engines of the Jeju Air aircraft that crashed in South Korea, killing 179 people. Traces of a type of migratory duck were discovered in the plane, which landed at Muan Airport without its landing gear deployed. And an undersea fibre optic cable linking Latvia with the Swedish island of Gotland has been severely damaged in a suspected sabotage attack. The Latvian Prime Minister has said the damage to the cable was probably caused by external influence. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, the future of Ukraine was the theme that marked this year's edition of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos. But what role can Europe play in peace negotiations if they ever happen? And how are European nations helping Ukraine rebuild? Well, to find out more, Monocle's senior foreign correspondent Carlotta Rebello caught up with Pierre Heilbronn, France's special envoy for Ukraine's relief and reconstruction. And they met during one of the coffee breaks at Davos, and she began by asking him about the biggest challenge of rebuilding efforts in a country that's still at war.
One particular challenge is sometimes the gap between perceptions and realities. And realities is that it's a country which is still at work, which has still from 3 to 5% of growth every year in the last 2 years. A lot of innovation, a lot of new businesses, a lot of energy and entrepreneurship in the country. My job is based on also existing companies from France, but also international companies which are in Ukraine, to also share this experience on the ground, which is still possible to make business there. It's still possible to earn money there. It's still possible also to be present, to contribute to the well-being of the country and to its resilience and prepare the future of the country.
Tell me a bit more about France's particular interests here and particular ambition. So how important is it for France to be an active partner in this effort?
There are different levels to that. There is obviously the political level, and as you know, President Macron has been extremely engaged in defending the principles which are at stake, but also providing solutions, ideas to get out of this situation while guaranteeing in a sustainable manner the future of the country. But I think What is at stake is also the economic integration of Ukraine in Europe and its development. And there, obviously, France has a special responsibility because French companies are the first foreign employers in Ukraine. 180 of them are employing nearly 30,000 employees. They all stayed since 2022. Second, there has been new investments since 2022, mostly incremental investment by existing companies in Ukraine, but also one investment which is, I think, landmark, which is the one of Xavier Niel, who is holding NJJ, who bought the fixed telecom network and the third mobile telecom network, a transaction investment of total of 1.5 billion, which is the largest investment in Ukraine for the last 10 years at least. So it shows that even now you can invest now in Ukraine. And that's, I think, is a very important message. And we are very proud that it's a French entrepreneur who took this decision, which I hope will open also the eyes of the international community, economic and business community, which is here in Davos, because this sends also a message that reconstruction or investment opportunities are not for in 10 years' time, but are for now.
Well, and speaking of now, just last week you delivered 20,000 tons of rails to Ukraine. So this is to Ukradinetsia, the Ukrainian railways. And that shows the importance of literally keeping things moving in the country and to rebuild the railway as it gets damaged. Tell me about this partnership and why this is kind of a crucial, different way of also showing support.
So infrastructure is really key for the development of the country. Rail has been very much crucial in the last 3 years because to export grain, to import also ammunitions and weapons and deliver them on the front line, you need more or less transportation, and the most efficient way is to do that through rail. Hence also a comprehensive package of discussion we are having with UZ, the rail company, which starts with this delivery of 20,000 of tons of rail, the equivalent of 150 kilometers of network. This has been backed also by a concessional financing by the French state. We want to develop that and afterwards to open also to this company, which thanks to that contract will also be able to safeguard 60 jobs in France. So I think it's typically a win-win agreement which brings essential needs from the Ukrainian railway company, but also create jobs in France and reconcile the two sides of that.
President Zelensky was here and he made quite some strong remarks and essentially a wake-up warning for Europe to step up. How did you take those comments and what do you make of them? And then do you believe that Europe can step up to his call?
I think it was quite an exceptional speech, also because it was a speech of the president of Ukraine, but also probably a speech of a future European leader. In fact, quite close to what some European leaders, especially the French president, has been making in the last years, in the last days. For example, in the conference for the ambassadors, very much on the line. We talk a lot. Let's now, when we talk about economy of war, what does it mean in terms of increased production, in terms of leadership, in terms of innovation? So listening to him, in fact, it was very much also a wake-up call, which is, I think, very much in the minds of many Europeans. I think it's very important in the current geopolitical context to reaffirm this ambition, but also to focus on what is needed from a European perspective. And what is very striking in this speech is that President Zelensky talked about Europe. And it was one of the first times where he was very much centering his message as one of the European family in the future. And I think that's quite important. I think there is also a growing awareness in very different parts of Europe that unity is crucial and that also concrete implications of political speeches are very important to meet the challenges.
There's been as well the strong words from Donald Trump and this push that he has made on his social media platform about Putin, it is time to end this dangerous war. Where is Europe in this conversation and where is France?
First, a solution should imply having Ukrainians on board. Second, providing the security guarantees which are essential not to seek peace for peace, but a long-lasting peace which can create the conditions for prosperity investment in Ukraine. This is really crucial. And security guarantees mean also involvement of Europeans even on things which we've not done in the past. Hence also the proposals of President Macron he put on the table in February when we host this conference, international conference in Paris, where he said that we shouldn't have more or less red lines. We should discuss all options, including on-the-ground presence of the international community. At that time, many people were saying that's a typically French idea. Nobody is supporting that, never. And we see in the last month that these ideas have been gaining ground in a reflection about the package of guarantees which should be provided by the Americans, but also by the Europeans, if Ukraine doesn't join NATO now, to make it credible in the Russian eyes that we are there for Ukraine, not only for 2 months, 6 months, 6 years, but really, therefore, like in a partner of and a member of the European Union, which Ukraine will be one day.
Pierre Halbrun there, France's special envoy for Ukraine's relief and reconstruction. He was talking to Monocle's Carlotta Rebello in Davos. You're with Monocle Radio. Time now for a look at some climate news. Sheena Rossiter is Monocle's contributing editor in Edmonton, Canada. Very good evening to you, Sheena.
Hello, good morning to you.
Look, we have to immediately touch on the huge gestures and moves that Donald Trump has made in his first week as president of the US. I mean, where are the big shifts?
Well, I mean, this wasn't a surprise because he did say he was going to do this. So on day one in office, Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Accord. Now, we've certainly seen this before. This is the second time that he's done it. He did it the first time around during his first term, and then the Biden administration reversed it. But the difference here is the reactions from some very powerful people. So from Silicon Valley, it's quite the opposite from what we saw of their critical reactions that we saw tech leaders take back in 2017 when he withdrew for the first time. So back in 2017, Silicon Valley executives, they urged Trump not to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. In fact, more than 24 CEOs at the time signed a letter urging Trump not to withdraw. And then they took that letter and published it as a full-page ad both in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Elon Musk was one of them back in 2017, where he threatened to leave the White House Advisory Council if Trump withdrew. And now here we are 8 years later, and it's a very different picture. So what we all saw last week at the inauguration was that tech leaders just peppered the stage behind Trump, and Elon Musk in particular had a very starring role during the inauguration. In fact, in the lead up to the inauguration, he spent some $277 million to help Trump and other Republicans get elected in 2014. And in general, this time around, the response from Silicon Valley has been silence, and critics have called this silence as cowardly, saying that it reflects that for these tech executives, clearly they're more concerned about profit than the environment and the American people. But some organizations like Amazon, spokespeople have come out saying that that retailer is still committed to its net zero carbon emissions, which the company has said all the global operations for Amazon will be net zero by 2040. And they've stuck by that. But still, the reaction to withdrawing from the climate accord has been pretty silent from Silicon Valley.
The interesting thing, though, is that although we're seeing the likes of Silicon Valley being quieter, there are others who are actually stepping up. So we had the billionaire Michael Bloomberg stepped in to help the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, saying it will remain fully funded despite the US ending its international climate contributions. Withdrawing from the Paris Accord is one thing. And we know now just how prepared Donald Trump is and how ready he is for government. But the fact is that those who still wish for the United States to play a significant part are stepping up themselves.
Yeah, it's really interesting what Michael Bloomberg has said that he will do. So basically, Washington typically provides about 22% of the United Nations secretarial budget. And just to give you an idea of how much that costs, it's about $96.5 million US dollars. And that was the operating budget for 2024-2025. And Michael Bloomberg has said that his foundation will now fill that gap. And that's what they're looking to do, especially as we lead up to COP30, which will take place in Brazil in the fall. So this will have huge repercussions globally, but even though some billionaires on the West Coast have said, well, they haven't said anything. On the East Coast, Michael Bloomberg is stepping up and making noise about the U.S. pulling out.
Why do we think that these tech executives completely changed their opinion when it comes to climate? I mean, is it just a simple, straightforward desire to please the man in power?
I think there's probably a little bit of that at play, but what some analysts are saying is that this is just a welcome return to business. They did initially welcome Biden's climate policies when he came into office. But the issue is, what a lot of people are saying is that the Biden administration really doubled down on antitrust lawsuits against some of these big tech giants. So to be clear, these antitrust lawsuits were actually started by the Trump administration. But then when Biden came in, these lawsuits were already filed against Google and Facebook, and then there were more lawsuits that were filed against Apple and Amazon. So Biden administration also tended to side with the unionization of Amazon, for example, siding more with the working man as opposed to the big corporation. So some analysts have said that Silicon Valley are kind of looking for this more pro-business stance that Trump has to offer. And he said himself, Trump, that he's going to continue to use fossil fuels to fuel these data centers, and also that there's a big push to AI. So they are more, that is the suspicion, is that they are thinking he's more pro-business than what Biden was doing.
Tell us how the international community is reacting to all this.
Yeah, so as we lead up to COP30, and now with the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, Andre Correa do Lago, who was recently appointed as the head of the UN COP30 conference, he's an experienced diplomat and a climate negotiator himself. He's expressed concern over the U.S. withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, saying that it's going to make it much, much harder to curb global emissions. And Brazil is kind of one of the leaders when it comes to one of the greenest electricity grids. That's thanks to all the hydropower that comes from the Amazon. So there has been reaction, and there are concerns, especially after COP29, where they worked really hard to get this finance deal with richer nations repaying some of the poorer nations in the global south. But now we're already seeing some of that being a bit undone, with people who've committed to that and big organizations now recanting and pulling back their promises. That the fact that the U.S. is now pulled out, it is concern for not just the international community, but also countries in the global south. Will these commitments be honored through the finance agreements that they worked so long and hard to commit to back in the fall in Baku?
Sheena Rossiter, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Edmonton. You're The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
musical equivalent of a hit class. In heels, big knickers and a frilly skirt. The can-can is famous for being fast and furious, rather fruity, and for being quintessentially French. Well, the government's now decided to add the dance to the list of the country's intangible cultural heritage. And joining me now, limbering up, is Simon Bouvier, who's Monocle's Paris bureau chief. Good morning, Simon.
Good morning, Emma.
Have you ever seen a can-can performed?
I have, indeed. I think most of France has, with it's featuring in the opening ceremony of the Olympics, but I have also gone to cabaret myself in the past.
It's a bit of a phenomenon, isn't it? And quite strangely, given what we often think about it as in terms of what it represents, it's a strikingly feminist dance, apparently.
Yes, well, it was invented in the early 19th century by a dancer and prostitute called Céleste Mogador, and it was an athletic take on the traditional quadrille dance. And then it kind of grew in popularity from there, especially thanks to the famous Moulin Rouge Cabaret, who had kind of a professional troupe who performed it. And so, yes, as you said, it was considered at times improper, and at times it was shut down because it was considered a challenge to patriarchal codes because of just how much it featured star female dancers.
And now it is so precious that the government wants to preserve it as an intangible part of heritage.
That's right. I think in a sense, the measures that they've announced are quite modest. We're talking about 475,000 euro fund to support cabarets. It's not much money. It's mostly geared towards increasing visibility for the sector and supporting its many professions, because there's the dancers, but there are also the costume makers, there are the showrunners, there's all sorts of different professions behind it. And it's also throwing its weight, as you mentioned, behind a bid that's been pushed by the Moulin Rouge Cabaret to have it put on this list that France has of intangible cultural heritage alongside other traditional dances and games like pétanque, for instance.
There's a fear sometimes that when a government has to step in to protect something, it is because it is at risk. I mean, the last time I was in Paris, I was near the Folies Bergère, and it was closed for days upon days. I mean, is there a sense that cabaret and indeed the can-can is struggling and needs help?
Actually, I think, Emma, it's more of an exception to that rule in this case. I agree with you that normally when you announce support for something, it's because it's in need of a boost. But in this case, it really feels more like Rachida Dati, the culture minister, is kind of trying to surf on a wave of popularity that can is benefiting from. Ever since the pandemic, it's really been growing in popularity. There are 200 theaters where 200 cabaret theaters in all of France, and they generate about 225 million euros. It's not nothing every year, and they're often the only cultural touch point, along with cinemas in provincial towns. So, and the young generation has been going to it as well, because we often think of the traditional kind of revue style, the can heavy shows that are very frequented by tourists in Paris. But really, they're theaters where food and drink is served before, during, and after the show. So, that category is pretty broad. And a lot of independent alternative, as they say, cabarets are creating all sorts of different plays and performances that are appealing to a younger audience, which is obsessed with musicals. If you want to make a parallel to the United States, for example, where those kinds of performances and titles are increasing in popularity as well.
Simon Bouvier, thank you so much for joining us on the line. Finally, the Greek designer Marika Transu's namesake label's synonymous with kaleidoscopic prints and 3D silhouettes. She sat down with Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director, to talk about her new role as Bulgaria's first creative director of leather goods and accessories.
I've admired Bulgari as a brand for as long as I can remember. And, I think in many ways my work as a designer has been shaped by Bulgari, because I grew up looking at Bulgari books. I had such a love for jewellery, and also my first my graduate collection from Central St. Martin's was about trompe-l'oeil supersize collages of pieces of jewelry that would be, too heavy or impossible pieces to wear. So my love for and my appreciation for jewelry had always been present. And of course, Bulgari for me has always been my favorite high jeweler because there's so much narrative and cultural symbolism in every icon, whether it's Serpenti or Tubogas or Monete. So I've always felt drawn to that brand. So the way our partnership came to be initially was I was invited to collaborate on a project called Serpenti Through the Eyes Of, where they invite different artists, designers to reinterpret the Serpenti bag. And so that came first, Serpenti Through the Eyes of Mary Katranzu. And it was the first time that I think a designer looked at Serpenti, and instead of only having it as a clasp to open your bag, I turned it into a handle for the bag. It became a Serpenti head minaudière. So it was really showcasing the snake in a different light. And it was a big commercial success for Bulgari, so much so that now we have a line called Serpentine, which is all about bags where the snake is the handle. And so that led to a collaboration with Bulgari Fragrances and another collaboration on high craftsmanship bags. And I think it was at that point that Mireia, the MD for Leather Goods and Accessories, approached me to make it official, let's say, and invited me to join the Bulgari family by creating a role that has never been part of Bulgari's structure. The Leather Goods and Accessories have never had a creative director. And so it was a great honor and privilege to take on that role, but it came at the right time. I had already moved to Athens. My business was already structured differently to accommodate for that move. And I was in a position that is rare for a designer to be in, which is having the time to collaborate with a brand before joining officially, having the time to develop trust in one another. So I felt quite confident in terms of being able to bring my own vision to the future of the bags and the accessories.
And it's so interesting that, like you say, it is a newly created role. And looking at the industry in the past, these worlds, fashion, accessories and fine jewelry were a lot more siloed and there were clear divisions between the two. I think the worlds are merging a lot more and Bulgari is kind of driving that change by bringing you on board, having more of a conversation between their jewelry and fashion accessories collections. Why do you think there's more of this merge of the worlds and breaking down of the barriers?
When it comes to Bulgari, I think Bulgari has always had a pioneering spirit as a brand. And so it's a bold move to bring in a designer with no prior experience in bags, coming from the world of fashion, for a brand that's hard luxury and has never been about fashion. It's always about timeless pieces, and it's always, talking about, let's say, the beauty and excellence of the high jewelry. But it's also a brand that, and probably the only brand that has managed to have legitimacy in so many different brand categories. There's the high jewelry, there's the fine jewelry, there's watches, there's hospitality, there's fragrance, and there's leather goods and accessories. And each category has an authenticity and a legitimate space in the world of luxury. And so that I find is very unique at Bulgari already. So I think, Bulgari is the brand to be able to say we want all our categories to be in dialogue and to communicate one brand. And I think that's very important. I think when you talk about brand that has so many layers, having the cross-pollination and dialogue between divisions is where real excellence, where you allow for real excellence to happen, because you're creating pieces that are based on a design integrity that has 140 years worth of heritage. And so I feel in that context, having that unification that you talked about, or this one brand approach, works. I don't think it works equally for every brand or feels authentic in every brand, but I think it's very important for all the categories to talk the same narrative. And the story that we tell with bags is the story of Bulgari. You know, it's no different. We speak the same icons, we speak the same language, and, you know, we, let's say, work around the same symbols.
Bulgari's Mary Katransu there, talking to Monocle's Natalie Theodosi. That's all the time we have for today's programme. Thank you to all my guests and to the producers Anita Riotta and Hassan Anderson, and our studio manager Flynn Simons. For me, Emma Nelson, goodbye.